Don't get involved. This is the price she pays for embarrassing the family. That was the text message I received from my own mother as I looked at my sister, battered and bleeding on my doorstep. In that instant, every illusion I ever had about family shattered into dust. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot they weren't just picking a fight with a daughter. They were picking a fight with a soldier. My name is Captain Perry Flint. I'm a military police officer at Joint Base Lewis McChord. I'm trained for the unexpected. I'm trained for violence, for chaos, for the moments when the world splinters into 1,000 sharp pieces. But nothing, not a single day in the Army, could have prepared me for the sound of the knocking that tore through the 2 a.m. silence. It wasn't a request for help. It was the sound of pure, clawing desperation. A frantic panic drumming that beat in time with the relentless October rain against my apartment window in Tacoma. My training took over before my mind could catch up. I moved silently from my bed, my feet cold on the hardwood floor. My hand hovered over the drawer where I keep my service weapon, a familiar, solid weight in the darkness. I approached the door with the caution of a tactical entry, my body coiled, ready for a threat. But when I swung the door open, the sight that greeted me was worse than any raid. It was my sister, Ilara. My older sister, the one who was always so poised, so perfect. Her life a curated masterpiece of social grace. Now, she was a crumpled, shuddering form on my doorstep. Her signature blonde hair, which our mother always called her crowning glory, was matted with a dark mixture of rainwater and blood. Her face was swollen, her lips split. Behind her, a silent, harrowing shadow, was my 8-year-old niece, Ren. She sat in her worn, slightly rusted wheelchair, her face a blank canvas of shock. But her small hands were clutching the armrest so tightly, her knuckles were bone-white. The chill of the Washington rain was nothing compared to the icy dread that radiated from that scene. I didn't say a word. There were no words. There was only action. I reached out, grabbed the wet wool of Ilara's coat, and pulled both of them inside. I slammed the door shut, the heavy thud a futile attempt to lock out the cruel world that had done this to them. As I was easing Ilara onto my couch, trying to peel away her soaked coat, my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The screen glowed with a single name, Mother. For a split second, a foolish, desperate flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe she was worried. Maybe she found out. Maybe she cares. I walked over, my heart thumping with a stupid, childish need for reassurance. But the message that appeared on the screen wasn't a question. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a dagger driven straight into my heart. All caps, cold, and final. Don't get involved. This is the price she pays for embarrassing the family. I read it once, then twice. Then a third time, each letter searing itself into my soul like acid. Embarrassing the family, not a single question about Ilara, not a word about Ren. My sister was bleeding on my floor, and the only thing our mother, Genevieve, cared about was her pristine public image. A hot, furious rage, pure and more intense than anything I had ever felt on a battlefield, surged through me. This wasn't indifference. This was a sentence, a verdict. My mother had just declared, without a shadow of a doubt, which side she was on. Have you ever felt that profound sting of betrayal from the one person who was supposed to protect you, no matter what? In that moment, the ground fell away beneath my feet, and I felt utterly alone in a war I didn't even know had been declared. The rage solidified into ice. My MP training kicked in again, a cold, mechanical professionalism that walled off the pain. I turned back to Ilara. I had a mission. Assess the damage, secure the victim. I gently slid the heavy, wet coat off her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a silk blouse, an expensive, elegant piece I knew Genevieve had bought for her, a prop for the perfect daughter role. But the silk was torn, ripped open at the side, and beneath it, a monstrous bruise was already blooming across her ribs. It was a violent, ugly mosaic of purple and black, the distinct, horrifying shape of a man's hand branded into her skin. This wasn't just a wound from a fight. This was an act of humiliation, designed to shatter her dignity. Ren, who had been silent this whole time, wheeled herself closer. She held out her small hand. In her palm lay her necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small wren charm, her namesake. The charm was bent, grotesquely twisted out of shape. Uncle Gideon pulled it off, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. That's when I understood. They weren't just attacking her body. They were systematically trying to erase the person she was, piece by humiliating piece. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the Tacoma night. Inside the swaying, sterile box, Ilara was still pleading with me, her voice hoarse with tears and terror. Don't call the police, Perry, please. He'll take Ren from me. But it was Ren, the silent witness, who finally broke the spell of fear. With a clarity that belied her age, she looked directly at me, her clear eyes holding mine. A uniformed officer sat across from us, his notepad open. Grandma was there, Ren said, her voice small but steady. The officer's pen froze. Uncle Gideon was yelling, she continued. And Grandma told Mom not to make a scene. She said, "Don't let the neighbors hear, Ilara. Think of the family's reputation." The officer began to write, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. The innocent words of an 8-year-old child had just detonated a bomb in the middle of our lives. They had exposed the whole, rotten truth. Genevieve wasn't just a bystander. She was an accomplice. She was the gatekeeper to my sister's own private hell. And the war, I thought, had just been declared? I realized it had been raging for a very, very long time. The waiting room at Tacoma General was a sterile, soundless purgatory. The air hung thick with the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic, a smell that was supposed to signify healing but only felt like a chemical void. I sat motionless, a cold, forgotten cup of coffee resting in my hand. The steady, rhythmic beep of a machine somewhere down the hall was the only thing tethering me to the harsh reality of the moment. Ilara was in a room somewhere behind a closed door, and Ren was being checked over in pediatrics, her silent trauma being assessed by strangers. But my mind wasn't there. It had drifted back, sifting through the wreckage of the past, trying to pinpoint the exact origin of this rot. The truth was, it wasn't a single event, a single betrayal. It was a map, drawn over decades with 1,000 tiny, invisible cuts. It was a landscape of slights, of words that sliced like razors, of a favoritism so deeply ingrained it was disguised as love. Genevieve never screamed. She was far more dangerous than that. She was the kind of woman who could kill you with a sweetly worded disappointment, a perfectly timed sigh, a sad, tight-lipped smile that told you, more effectively than any shout, that you had failed her. She had perfected the art of making you feel worthless while convincing the world she was the most supportive mother imaginable. It was a quiet, insidious form of violence, one that left no bruises but inflicted wounds that never seemed to heal. My memory first lands on a Sunday evening when I was 16. I was buzzing, practically vibrating with pride. After months of late-night research, poring over books in the library, and relentlessly practicing my delivery in front of a mirror, I had won first place in the statewide debate competition. The trophy was heavy in my hands, a solid, gleaming testament to my effort, and I couldn't wait to show it to her. That same week, Ilara, then 20 and effortlessly beautiful, had been asked to model in a high-society charity fashion show. At our family dinner, one of those tense, mandatory affairs in Genevieve's immaculate North End home, surrounded by polished silver and crystal that seemed to judge you, I eagerly placed my trophy on the dining table. Genevieve glanced at it, her lips curving into that familiar, faint smile. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her voice light, dismissive, before her gaze immediately shifted. Her eyes, turning to Ilara, lit up with a genuine, incandescent pride I had never once been the recipient of. "But Ilara," she leaned forward, her voice rich with excitement, "you must tell me all about the gown. Which designer was it? You looked absolutely stunning in the newspaper photos." And just like that, my trophy, a symbol of months of intellectual labor and dedication, was pushed to the side, rendered invisible by the shimmer of a designer dress. It sat there on the mahogany table, a forgotten relic. That was the first time the lesson was branded into my mind with such cold clarity. My hard work, my intellect, would never be the right currency in our family. The only thing that truly mattered was the flawless, beautiful image Alara projected. An image Genevieve saw as a direct reflection of her own success. The second scar was deeper, a wound of financial and emotional exploitation disguised as a family obligation. When Alara married Gideon, Genevieve orchestrated a wedding of breathtaking expense at a pristine seaside country club. It wasn't a celebration of love, it was a performance, designed to broadcast the Thorne family's status to all of Tacoma's elite. A few months before the wedding, while she was sorting through invitation samples printed on thick, creamy cardstock, she made her suggestion. She told me, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather, that the most meaningful gift I could give would be to pay for their entire Hawaiian honeymoon. After all, she'd said, not even looking up from a swatch of ivory linen, it's not as if you have a family of your own to worry about, and your officer's salary is quite good. The words were a quiet, elegant blackmail. She was using my career, the one thing I had built for myself, away from her, and my single status as justification. But I was still caught in that old, desperate loop of trying to earn her approval, a futile cycle I couldn't seem to break. So, I agreed. I drained nearly all the savings I'd been painstakingly putting aside for a new truck. I transferred the money, feeling a hollow pit in my stomach that had nothing to do with the amount and everything to do with the transaction's coldness. At the wedding reception, I watched as Genevieve stood to give her toast, a vision of maternal grace in champagne-colored lace. She raised her crystal flute, thanking their many generous friends who had contributed to making the day so special. My name was never mentioned. My sacrifice was erased. In that moment, I wasn't her daughter. I was a means to an end, an anonymous, functional resource to be used and then forgotten. I was a tool to help polish the family brand. Back in the fluorescent glare of the hospital waiting room, my fingers tightened and the paper coffee cup in my hand collapsed with a faint crunch. The cold, bitter liquid spilled over my knuckles, but I barely felt it. With that small physical collapse, a lifetime of denial finally shattered within me. I had spent my entire life on a fool's errand, trying to win the approval of someone fundamentally incapable of giving it. My mother didn't love me. She loved the idea of a daughter she could show off. Alara was her trophy, and I was the utility. The one who was practical, but never quite dazzling enough for the display case. The vague sense of duty I'd always felt morphed into something hard and clear. It became a tactical imperative. I remembered a verse from an old Bible my grandmother used to read, her voice a low, comforting hum. By their fruit, you will recognize them. The fruit of Genevieve and Gideon was destruction, pain, and humiliation. My own personal rules of engagement, the ones I lived by as a soldier, were crystal clear. My mission was to protect the innocent. My mission was to stop that destruction. I stood up, my joints stiff from sitting for so long. I walked to the trash can and dropped the crushed, wet cup inside. The empty gesture felt like a final, binding oath. The time for feeling hurt was over. It was time to plan a counteroffensive. The next morning, I walked back into Tacoma General with a singular purpose. The sterile smell of the hospital no longer felt like a void. It felt like a battlefield I needed to navigate with precision. Alara was sitting up in bed, looking a little better physically, but her eyes were still wide with the haunted look of a cornered animal. The fear was a tangible thing in the small beige room. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I walked to her bedside and placed a neatly folded stack of papers on the rolling table next to her half-eaten Jell-O. It was a power of attorney document. I need you to sign this, Alara, I said. My tone wasn't a suggestion. It was a gentle but firm command. This was the first step, the first move on the chessboard. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the papers as if they were venomous, the ingrained fear of making a scene. A fear so carefully cultivated by our mother was still her default setting. Gideon will, she began, her voice a trembling whisper. I cut her off, my own voice as cold and hard as steel. Gideon no longer has a say. You and Ren are my mission now. I tilted my head toward the corner of the room. Ren was sitting quietly, engrossed in a picture book, creating a small, safe world for herself in the midst of the chaos. She was pretending not to listen, but her shoulders were tense. "Do it for her," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. Alara's eyes followed my gaze. She looked at her daughter, a long, heart-wrenching look. Then her eyes met mine. I saw a flicker of the old pre-Gideon Alara in them, a spark of defiance I thought had been extinguished long ago. Her trembling hand reached for the pen I offered. She signed her name. The signature was shaky, almost illegible, but it was the first gunshot of the war. It was the moment the power began to shift. With the notarized document in my possession, I drove back to my apartment. My small, quiet home, usually a refuge from the world, was no longer a place of rest. It was now a tactical operations center. I sat at my small dining table, opened my laptop, and using the authority Alara had just granted me, logged into her bank account. What I found made a wave of nausea roll through me. It was worse than I had imagined. Every month, like clockwork, Ren's disability benefits from the VA, money meant for her care, her therapy, her future, were directly deposited into a joint account. An account held not by Alara and Gideon, but by Gideon Croft and Genevieve Thorne. My fingers flew across the keyboard, my heart pounding with a cold fury. I accessed the joint account. The screen lit up with a detailed history of their transactions, and the evidence was damning, laid out in neat, digital columns. There were no expenditures for a new wheelchair, no payments for physical therapy, no funds set aside for Ren's specialized needs. Instead, there were thousands of dollars spent on first-class tickets to Aspen. Extravagant dinner receipts from Canlis, the most exclusive restaurant in Seattle, with bills running into the high hundreds. Charges from Louis Vuitton and Neiman Marcus. They had turned my niece's pain, her disability, into a currency for their lavish lifestyle. They were parasites, feeding on the most vulnerable member of our family, all while lecturing us about appearances and reputation. The initial shock of rage was quickly replaced by the ice-cold focus of an investigator. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This had crossed into serious criminal territory. I needed professional advice. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Master Sergeant Corvus, an old friend and a gray wolf at the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, at JBLM, answered on the second ring. "Corvus, it's Flint. I'm in some trouble," I said, keeping my voice level, factual. I laid out the situation with the detached precision of an incident report. The assault, the financial records, the joint account. No emotion, just facts. Corvus listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Flint," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You're looking at federal benefits fraud. That's a felony. Do not go at this alone. He's a veteran, which means the VA will tear him to shreds if you have proof. But you need a civilian lawyer, a real shark. And listen to me." His voice grew more intense. "Document everything. Every text, every call, everything. This is an evidence game now." His advice wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from a seasoned professional. It solidified my next step. I hung up and immediately searched for a name that was whispered with a mixture of respect and fear in the Pierce County legal community. Asha Kalra. Her reputation preceded her. They called her the Shark. I found her office number and took a deep, steadying breath before dialing. A crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. "Asha Kalra's office." I stood up, my posture straightening as if I were reporting to a commanding officer. "This is Captain Perry Flint," I said, my voice unwavering. "I need to hire the best attorney in Tacoma for a case involving domestic violence and financial fraud. I have evidence." There was a brief, assessing silence on the line. Then, Asha's voice came back, and this time I could hear a distinct note of interest. "Captain," she said, "be in my office at 8 or 900 tomorrow, and bring everything you have." The call ended. I lowered the phone, a new sense of grim determination settling over me. The first shots had been fired. And I had just recruited my first piece of heavy artillery. The next morning, before I could even leave for my Zur 900 meeting with Asha Kalra, The enemy brought the fight to my doorstep. He didn't knock. Gideon was too arrogant for that. My phone buzzed with his name. "I'm downstairs," he said, his voice syrupy smooth, laced with a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "We need to talk." I remembered Corvus's words, "Document everything." I took a slow, deliberate breath, my training kicking in to steady my racing heart. I tapped the screen of my phone, activating the voice recorder, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I walked downstairs to face him. He was leaning against a gleaming black Mercedes, an ostentatious display of wealth parked brazenly in the middle of my modest, military-issued apartment complex near JBLM. The car, I knew with a sickening certainty, had been bought with Ren's money. The contrast was a slap in the face. He was flaunting his crimes right in front of me. He had a charming, disarming smile plastered on his face as I approached, his arms crossed over his chest. "Perry," he started, his tone oozing condescension, "you're making this all so much more complicated than it needs to be. Ilara was just a little emotional. You know how she gets." He was trying to gaslight me, to repaint the brutal assault as a simple spat between a hysterical woman and a concerned husband. I remembered something I'd once read from Brené Brown. Clear is kind. Unclear is unkind. For years, my family had operated in the murky, painful territory of the unclear. No more. I decided my clearest response was silence. I just stood there, my arms at my sides, and stared directly into his eyes, letting my silence be a wall he could smash himself against. It didn't take long. His charming smile began to falter, twitching at the edges. My refusal to engage, to be drawn into his narrative, was robbing him of his power. He needed a reaction, and my stillness was infuriating him. "Look," he said, his voice hardening, the velvet glove slipping off the iron fist. "You don't want to make an enemy of me. I have friends, Perry. Friends in high places." When I still didn't respond, his composure finally shattered. The mask of the charming veteran fell away, revealing the raw, narcissistic rage underneath. "You know, your mother-in-law's right about you," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Just a blunt little soldier girl playing army. You think that uniform protects you? You think it means anything in the real world?" He took a step closer, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Genevieve can make one phone call. One. And that shiny career of yours will evaporate into thin air." The threat hung in the air between us, ugly and explicit. He had not only confirmed Genevieve's role in this, but he had also directly threatened the one part of my life I had built for myself, the one place I had always felt valued. I held his gaze, my expression unreadable, my silence absolute. With a final, frustrated growl, he turned, wrenched open the door of his blood-money Mercedes, and sped away, tires squealing on the wet pavement. I stood there for a long moment, then calmly reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. I had it. A priceless, damning piece of evidence. Gideon wasn't bluffing. That afternoon, I was summoned to the office of my commanding officer, Colonel Valerius. He was a good man, fair and by the book. But the look on his face was grim. "Captain Flint, have a seat," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I received a call this morning from a Mrs. Genevieve Thorne." My blood ran cold. "She has filed a formal complaint against you. The allegations are serious. Abuse of your military position to interfere in a family matter and harassment of her son-in-law, a fellow veteran." It was a direct, vicious strike aimed with surgical precision at my single greatest vulnerability, my career. The uniform I wore with such pride, the structure and meritocracy of the army that had been my refuge from my mother's cold judgment. For a dizzying moment, the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. This was a new level of betrayal. My mother wasn't just abandoning me, she was actively trying to destroy me. I walked into Asha Kalra's downtown office feeling the weight of that betrayal, but I kept my shoulders back and my expression neutral. Asha was exactly as I'd imagined. A sharp, intelligent woman in a perfectly tailored power suit, her office a testament to organized, formidable success. She did not waste time. "Captain, tell me what happened," she said, her voice a tool of pure efficiency. I laid it all out, the assault, the financial statements I'd printed, and finally, the new complaint from my mother. Then I placed my phone on her polished desk. And this happened this morning. I pressed play. We listened in silence as Gideon's smooth voice turned to angry threats. As the recording ended with the squeal of his tires, a slow, cold, confident smile spread across Asha Kalra's face. It was the smile of a shark that had just scented blood in the water. "Magnificent," she said, her voice a low purr of satisfaction. "The fool just handed us his own head on a platter. And your mother?" She looked at me, her eyes sharp and assessing. "She just handed us the rope to hang him with." Asha leaned forward, all business. "Here is what we do now. First, we file for an emergency protection order. His recorded threat gives us more than enough cause. Second, regarding the military." She paused. "You will tell your colonel the entire truth. Show him the evidence you showed me. Give him a copy of this recording. Men like your mother's son-in-law and women like her believe their influence can bend the rules. They fail to understand a fundamental truth about the institution you serve, Captain. The military hates a mess, but it despises injustice even more." I stood at attention before Colonel Valerius's desk the next morning. His office was an orderly world of polished wood and steel, decorated with service awards and unit photos. It was a space that represented everything I respected: order, integrity, and merit. And now, that world was being threatened by the chaos my mother had unleashed. Following Asha's counsel, I didn't offer excuses or long-winded explanations. I presented my case like an intelligence briefing. I laid out the evidence on his desk in neat stacks: the bank statements with highlighted, fraudulent charges, copies of Ilara's medical reports detailing her injuries, and finally, the audio file of Gideon's threat queued up on my phone. "Sir," I began, my voice steady and professional. "With all due respect, this is not a family squabble. This is a case of documented abuse and federal fraud. I am acting not as a meddling sister, but as the legal power of attorney for my sister, and as the protector of my niece. The complaint against me is retaliation." Colonel Valerius listened, his face an impassive mask, his eyes sharp and analytical. He picked up each document, examining it with the same scrutiny he would a battlefield report. He listened to the entire audio recording without interruption. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by Gideon's recorded voice spitting venom. When it was over, the colonel leaned back in his chair. "Captain," he said finally, his tone measured, "this complaint against you will be investigated by the book, as per regulations. However," he gestured to the evidence on his desk, "this is deeply disturbing. Keep me updated on the civil matter." I left his office with a small but significant shift in my spirit. In his eyes, I was no longer just the subject of a complaint. I was now a credible source. The ground beneath my feet felt a little more solid. At the same time, across town, Asha Kalra moved with the swift, lethal grace of a predator. She filed a petition for a temporary protection order at the Pierce County Courthouse. In front of the judge, she didn't spin a tale of emotional pain. She was a surgeon, laying out facts with cold precision. She presented the sequence of events: the physical assault, the recorded threat, the systematic financial exploitation. "Your Honor," Asha's voice cut through the courtroom, clear and authoritative, "we are not dealing with a mere hot-headed husband. We are dealing with a predator who is targeting the most vulnerable members of his family for financial gain. And," she paused for effect, "he is doing so with the active support and complicity of his mother-in-law." The judge, a stern-faced woman who looked like she'd heard every lie imaginable, listened to Gideon's recorded threat. Her expression hardened. Without hesitation, her gavel came down. The protection order was granted immediately, prohibiting Gideon from coming within 100 yards of Ilara or Ren. It was a small victory, but it was the first brick in the legal wall we were building around them, a tangible, enforceable boundary. That evening, the enemy changed tactics. The phone rang, and the caller ID showed Genevieve's name. I hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker so Ilara, sitting on my couch, could hear. My mother wasn't arrogant or demanding. Her voice was thick with meticulously crafted tears. It was a performance I'd seen my whole life, the classic victim role she played so well. "Perry, what are you doing?" she sobbed. "You're tearing our family apart. Gideon just has a temper, you know that." Alara provoked him. "Why are you being so cruel to me after everything I've done for you girls?" "It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation," she went on, her voice choked with false grief, recounting her supposed sacrifices, framing my actions as a betrayal of her love, an act of profound ingratitude. She lamented how the pristine Thorne family name, the legacy our grandfather had built, was being dragged through the mud. It was a calculated psychological assault aimed directly at the deep-seated guilt and sense of obligation she had spent a lifetime instilling in me. And for a shameful, flickering moment, it almost worked. An old, conditioned reflex flared up, the urge to soothe her, to fix it, to take the blame. I remembered all the notes I'd reviewed from a criminal psychology course at Quantico, recognizing the pattern of narcissistic manipulators, the feigned love bombing, followed by punishment when their demands aren't met. This was it, playing out in real time. But then, in her desperation, Genevieve made a fatal mistake. "Just drop the lawsuit, honey," she pleaded, her sobs subsiding into a conspiratorial whisper. "Gideon promised he won't do it again. We can fix this. You just need to get Alara to sign a statement, just a little piece of paper saying she fell down the stairs, that's all. Then everything can go back to normal." Fell down the stairs. That single phrase. The request for Alara to lie, to erase her own pain to protect the man who had brutalized her. That was it. That was the final, definitive drop that made the cup overflow. Every last ounce of sympathy, every flicker of doubt in my soul, evaporated. All that was left was a cold, clear, and absolute certainty. The emotional fog she had always surrounded me with was gone. "No," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice I used on the job, the one that meant there was no room for negotiation. There was a stunned silence on her end. "You made your choice, Genevieve," I continued, the name feeling foreign and formal on my tongue. "You chose your side. Now you get to watch me choose mine." I ended the call. Then, with a steady hand, I opened my contacts, found her name, and pressed block. The last illusion had died. This war was going to the end. After I hung up on my mother, I stood motionless in the center of my living room. For a full minute, there was nothing. Just a profound, chilling silence where a lifetime of hope and obligation used to be. The air itself felt thin, brittle, like glass about to shatter. The phantom echo of her manipulative sobs still hung in the room, a toxic residue I could almost taste. Then, the rage I'd been suppressing for 38 years finally broke free. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a torrent of tears, it was something far more disciplined, a fury channeled through years of military training. I strode into my bedroom, yanked my heavy-duty canvas duffel bag from the back of the closet, and slung it over a support beam. Then, I began to punch it, methodically, rhythmically. Each solid, grounding strike was a punctuation mark in a long, silent indictment. Thud. For the forgotten debate trophy, left to gather dust on a mahogany table. Thud. For the exploited honeymoon payment, a sacrifice that was never even acknowledged. Thud. For a lifetime of lies and manipulation, of being told my worth was conditional. Thud. For my mother's ultimate, unforgivable betrayal, a knife twisted in my back. Thud. For Alara's pain. Thud. For Ren's fear. I punched until my lungs burned and sweat soaked through my t-shirt, plastering it to my skin. I punched until my knuckles ached with a dull, satisfying pain that overpowered the ache in my heart. And when I finally stopped, leaning against the heavy bag with my breath coming in ragged gasps, the white-hot rage was gone. It had been burned away as fuel, purified by the exertion. In its place was something else. Something cold, clear, and intensely focused. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a stark, quiet landscape of purpose. The grief had been processed. The anger had been released. Now, it was time for methodical action. That weekend, I transformed my living room. It was no longer a place for relaxation, it was a war room. I went to Office Depot and bought the largest whiteboard I could find, along with packs of dry erase markers in different colors. I mounted it on the main wall, the blank white surface, a canvas for my new strategy. In the center, in bold black marker, I wrote two names, Gideon Croft and Genevieve Thorne. From those names, I drew arrows, creating a web of their crimes, each a different front in our war. VA fraud in red, domestic assault in black, emotional manipulation in blue, obstruction of justice in green. I started to systematize the evidence, to build my arsenal. I printed out every bank statement using a yellow highlighter to mark each suspicious charge, every fancy dinner, every designer purchase. Ilara's medical records went into one meticulously labeled folder. A detailed, chronological log of every interaction, every text message, every threat went into another. I scoured old emails and text chains, finding more and more instances of casual cruelty and calculated deceit, each one a small piece of the larger, ugly puzzle. While searching for old financial documents in a storage box in my closet, my fingers brushed against a smaller, worn shoebox. Tucked away under old report cards and letters was a stack of photos. One of them stopped my breath. It was a picture of me and Ilara as kids, maybe 9 and 13, sitting on a park swing in Point Defiance Park, laughing with wide, unrestrained joy. Our heads were thrown back, our smiles genuine and carefree. Right next to it was a professional 8x10 photo from Ilara's wedding day. She stood beside a beaming Gideon and a triumphant-looking Genevieve. Ilara's smile in that picture was a pale, hollow imitation of the real thing. It was a mask. It didn't reach her eyes. I stared at the two photos side by side, the contrast, a physical ache in my chest. That was what this fight was about. I wasn't just fighting against them. I was fighting for her. For the girl on the swing. I was fighting to bring that real, unguarded smile back to my sister's face. I carefully placed the childhood photo on the corner of my desk, a constant reminder of my true objective. Each piece of paper I organized, each highlighted statement, became a bullet. I was meticulously and lethally loading my weapons. As I organized the evidence, I realized the civil court battle was only one front. Gideon's arrogant pride in his veteran status wasn't a shield. It was his Achilles' heel. I picked up my phone and called Master Sergeant Corvus again. "Corvus, it's Flint. I need a favor," I said, getting straight to the point. "I need to get my hands on Gideon Croft's military records, specifically his service record and his medical files from his discharge." There was a pause on the line. I knew I was asking him to walk a fine line, to operate in a gray area. "Flint," he said, his voice low and serious, "I can't just hand those over to you directly. You know that. It would be a major violation." But I could almost hear him thinking. If an official investigation is launched by the VA, those records would be subpoenaed as a matter of course. Have your lawyer make the request through official channels. And he hesitated for a second, his voice dropping even lower. Check his last deployment very, very carefully. There were rumors around the time he processed out. That's all I can say. Corvus's cryptic comment wasn't just a friendly tip. It was a flare fired in the dark. A secret was buried in those files, a vulnerability. It was the intelligence I needed to plan my attack. My old MP motto echoed in my head. Assist, protect, defend. This time the mission wasn't for the army. It was for the family I was choosing to protect, Ilara and Ren. That night, I sat down at my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face. I opened a new email to Asha Kalra. The subject line, I typed in all caps for emphasis, battle plan. The body of the email was short, clear, and structured like a military directive. I laid out the different fronts of our war. 1. Civil court, move for permanent protection order, file for sole legal and physical custody of Ren for Ilara. 2. VA investigation, file formal complaint for benefits fraud, citing the evidence from the joint bank account. 3. Military internal affairs, draft official response to Genevieve's grievance, presenting our evidence to counter her claims. I detailed my conversation with Corvus and urged her to officially request Gideon's full military record under discovery, with a special emphasis on his final deployment records. I finished the email with a single, declarative sentence. Ms. Thorne and Mr. Croft have declared war. It's time we returned fire. My finger hovered over the mouse. Clicking send was more than just a digital action. It was a commitment. It was my oath, my vow of no more silence, now encrypted and sent into the world. The battle had officially begun. Asha's advice was a direct order: follow the money. And so our investigation began with an archaeological dig into Alara's past. Because of the protection order, we were granted a police escort to the house she once shared with Gideon, the house that had become her prison. It was a strange, tense affair, walking through those familiar rooms under the watchful eye of two uniformed officers. We had 1 hour to retrieve her personal belongings, but we weren't just there for clothes and toiletries. We were on a hunt. We went straight to the home office, a room filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes of old paperwork. Following Asha's instructions, we started pulling out everything: old tax returns, loan agreements, credit card statements. At first, it all seemed depressingly normal. Then, acting on a hunch from Asha, I had Alara sign her name on a blank sheet of paper. We started comparing that fresh signature to the ones on the documents. And that's when the ugly truth began to bleed through the paper. One by one, we found them. Credit card applications she'd never seen, for cards that were mailed to a P.O. box he controlled. Small personal loans from online lenders, taken out in her name. The signatures were close. Gideon had clearly practiced. But under scrutiny, the forgery was undeniable. He had been systematically and secretly burying her in debt, siphoning the money into his own accounts while destroying her credit and financial standing. It was a quiet, insidious form of control. Alara sank to the floor, the damning papers fluttering around her like dead leaves. She was surrounded by the evidence of a betrayal so profound it was almost incomprehensible. She wrapped her arms around her knees and began to sob, not loudly, but with the quiet, broken despair of someone who realizes the life they thought they had was a complete fabrication. I trusted him, Perry, she wept into her hands. I really believed him. I knelt beside her on the floor. There were no words of comfort that could fix this, so I didn't offer any. I just put my hand on her shoulder, a firm, steady pressure. A silent promise. You're not alone in this anymore. Her sobs slowly subsided, and she looked up at me, her eyes red but filled with a new, hard resolve. Okay, she whispered, wiping her face. Let's make him pay for every single signature. Back at Asha's office, the second front of our war was opening up. True to her word, Asha had used her legal authority to subpoena Gideon's full military record from the VA. When the thick manila folder arrived, it felt as heavy as a tombstone. We spread the contents across her large conference table, a sea of official forms, commendations, and medical reports. We spent an entire evening poring over it, the air thick with the smell of coffee and determination. On the surface, his record was perfect, almost too perfect. Then, with my insider's knowledge of military paperwork, I spotted it. An anomaly. A detail a civilian lawyer might have missed. Gideon's disability claim, the source of the monthly checks he and Genevieve had been pocketing, was based on a severe back injury he claimed to have sustained during an ambush in Afghanistan. The report was detailed, dramatic, and convincing. But when I cross-referenced the date of the supposed ambush with his unit's deployment history, my blood ran cold. On the exact day he claimed to have been ambushed outside of Kandahar, his unit's official records placed them over 3,000 miles away, at the Grafenwöhr training area in Germany, conducting routine exercises. Oh my God, I breathed, my finger tracing the conflicting dates. He was never there. He was never in Afghanistan at that time. He made the whole thing up. Asha looked over my shoulder, her eyes widening as she understood the implication. This wasn't just benefits fraud anymore. This was a lie of monumental proportions. It was stolen valor. He had fabricated a story of combat injury, a story that dishonored every soldier who had ever actually bled for their country. This was our silver bullet. Just as we were processing the magnitude of this discovery, Alara's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but she answered it. Her expression shifted from caution to surprise. She motioned for me to listen. Alara, honey, it's Mrs. Gable from next door. Your old neighbor, a kind elderly voice said. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I saw the news about the protection order, and I've been thinking and thinking. She hesitated. I don't know if this means anything, but I saw it, dear, many times. Your mother, Genevieve, she would come by the house, take the official-looking envelopes out of your mailbox herself, and then hand Gideon cash. Right there in the driveway. I always thought it was so strange. Alara thanked her, her hand trembling as she hung up. We stared at each other. Mrs. Gable's testimony was the missing link. It wasn't just a joint bank account anymore. This was a witness who could place Genevieve at the scene of the crime, actively participating in the cash out of Wren's benefits. She had just been upgraded from a silent accomplice to an active co-conspirator. Asha leaned back in her chair, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She's our star witness. With our new arsenal, the forged signatures, the VA fraud, and a credible witness, Asha decided it was time to strike. She drafted and sent official subpoenas to both Gideon and Genevieve, summoning them for a formal hearing regarding the permanent protection order and the custody of Wren. And then, silence. The threatening texts stopped. The manipulative, tearful phone calls ceased. The other side went completely dark. It was an eerie, unsettling quiet that felt more dangerous than their noise. They're planning something, I said to Asha, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Asha nodded, her eyes sharp and cold as ice. Let them, she said, her voice laced with confidence. Let them plot. The more they hide, the more they fear what we have. The stage is being set, Captain, and we've already written the script for their downfall. The Pierce County courtroom was a cold, solemn space, all dark wood and imposing flags, designed to make you feel small. But as I sat beside Alara, I saw something in her I hadn't seen in years. Her back was straight, her hands were folded calmly in her lap. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. I remembered a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Today, my sister was finally withdrawing her consent. On the other side of the aisle, Gideon sat with his lawyer, radiating a smug, untouchable confidence. He even had the audacity to catch my eye and give me a slow, arrogant wink. A final, shameless act of intimidation. In the front row of the gallery, Genevieve sat perched like a queen on her throne, dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked less like a concerned grandmother and more like a spectator at the opera, waiting for the show to begin. And a show is what their lawyer gave. He started by painting a cruel, distorted portrait of my sister. He presented her as an unstable, depressive mother, incapable of caring for her own child. He showed the court carefully selected photos of Alara looking exhausted, photos taken after sleepless nights of caring for Wren. He twisted her words, presenting out-of-context text messages to craft a narrative of hysteria. It was a masterful performance, portraying Gideon as the long-suffering, worried husband. I felt Alara tense beside me, and I squeezed her hand under the table, whispering, "Let him talk. Let him build his own gallows." When it was our turn, Asha Kalra rose, her presence commanding the room's attention. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her composure a stark contrast to the theatrics we had just witnessed. The petitioner calls Mrs. Eleanor Gable to the stand, she announced, her voice calm and clear. A collective gasp went through the gallery. I watched as Gideon's smug expression froze, but the real show was Genevieve. Her mask of aristocratic poise shattered. Her perfectly made-up face went slack with shock, then tightened with unmistakable panic. This was the moment the audience and the judge saw the first crack in their facade. Mrs. Gable, a kindly-looking older woman with a gentle face, walked steadily to the witness stand. In a clear, unwavering voice, she recounted what she had seen. She described the multiple occasions she'd witnessed Genevieve retrieve the official VA envelopes from the mailbox, before handing Gideon wads of cash in the driveway. It didn't look like a family matter, Mrs. Gable concluded, her voice filled with simple conviction. It looked like a business transaction. Gideon's lawyer leaped to his feet, trying to discredit her. Mrs. Gable, do you hold some personal grudge against the family? Is that why you're here, to spread gossip? Mrs. Gable looked directly at him, her expression unwavering. I don't hold any grudges, sir, she said, her sincerity silencing the room. I just don't like to see a child being taken advantage of. The lawyer sat down, defeated. The first blow had landed. And then, Asha moved in for the kill. She presented Gideon's military record to the court, the thick file landing on the clerk's desk with a heavy thud. Mr. Croft, she began, her voice deceptively mild, you testified under oath that your disability stems from a severe back injury you received during an ambush in Afghanistan. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, Gideon said, puffing out his chest, falling right into the trap. He was proud of his lie. Asha picked up a single sheet of paper from the file. Then perhaps you can explain to the court, she said, her voice turning to ice, why on the exact date you claim you were ambushed near Kandahar, your unit's official service records show you were participating in a training exercise at the Grafenwehr training area. In Germany? The courtroom fell into a dead, ringing silence. Gideon's face went completely white. He looked like he'd been physically struck. He sputtered, stammered, trying to talk his way out of it, blaming a clerical error, a mix-up in the paperwork. But it was too late. The lie was exposed, naked and ugly, for everyone to see. Asha turned from the crumbling witness and addressed the judge. Your Honor, we don't just have a domestic abuser in this courtroom today. We have a fraud, a con man, a man who has stolen the honor and valor of every true soldier who has ever served this country. That was the breaking point. Gideon completely fell apart. He started shouting, pointing a trembling finger at the front row. It was her idea. She told me how to do it. She said we deserved the money. For the first time in her life, Genevieve Thorne lost control in public. Her face, a mask of fury and humiliation, contorted as she leaped to her feet. You ungrateful parasite, she shrieked at him. You were nothing. Order! The judge's gavel cracked down like a gunshot, the sound echoing through the chaotic room. Order in my court. The play was over. The curtain had fallen on their elaborate tragedy of lies. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. A permanent protection order was granted. Ilara was awarded full and sole legal custody of Ren. And the matter of the VA benefits fraud, now officially on the court record, was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for Federal Prosecution. With the final, sharp crack of the gavel, it was done. Ilara crumpled beside me, burying her face in her hands. She was crying. But for the first time in a decade, they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of relief, of liberation. I wrapped my arms around my sister, holding her tight as the weight of years of oppression finally lifted from her shoulders. The war was over. We had won. The day after the court hearing, there was no celebration, no triumphant toasts or victory laps. There was only a profound, heavy silence that filled every corner of my small apartment. Ilara and Ren had moved in with me temporarily, and my orderly, solitary space was now a cozy clutter of someone else's life. Ren's drawings taped to the fridge, Ilara's book left open on the coffee table. I found Ilara sitting by the window, staring out at the gray Tacoma rain, her expression unreadable. The storm outside seemed to mirror the quiet exhaustion inside. Are you okay? I asked softly, handing her a mug of tea. She turned, a sad ghost of a smile on her lips. It's strange, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I would feel ecstatic, vindicated. But I just feel hollow, empty. I knew exactly what she meant. It was the post-battle crash. The silence that descends after the last shot has been fired and the adrenaline has drained away, leaving only the bone-deep weariness and the quiet work of tending to the wounds. We didn't say anything more. We just sat there together, sharing the silence, watching the rain wash the city clean. A few days later, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, expensive cream-colored cardstock, addressed to Alara in our mother's elegant, looping handwriting. Genevieve's return address in the prestigious North End was printed in the corner. Alara's hand trembled as she took it from me. I stood close by, a silent guard, ready to intervene. She slid a finger under the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. I watched her face as she read the first few lines. I saw her expression shift from cautious curiosity to a familiar flash of pain, and then finally to a hard, quiet resolve. "It's still my fault," Alara said, her voice flat. "She says I've ruined the family's reputation, that Gideon was just a victim of my instability." She didn't need to read any more. It wasn't an apology. It was one last, desperate attempt to manipulate, one final volley of blame. Without another word, she folded the letter neatly. She walked to the sliding glass door that led to my small patio, where my little barbecue grill sat covered. She took the metal lid off the grill, placed the letter inside the empty basin, and, with a steady hand, lit it with a match. We stood side by side and watched as the flames caught the corners of the expensive paper. We watched the elegant, lying script turn black, curl into itself, and crumble into ash. The smoke, carrying the last toxic words of Genevieve Thorne, drifted up into the damp evening air and disappeared. It was a funeral pyre for a relationship that was already dead. It was a ritual of release. My own final acts were less dramatic, but just as necessary. The internal investigation into the complaint against me was concluded quickly. With the court's verdict, I was officially cleared of all accusations. Colonel Valerius called me into his office. "Captain," he said, and for the first time, I heard a clear note of respect in his voice that went beyond rank. "You did the right thing. You handled a difficult situation with integrity." He paused, looking at a file on his desk. "A command position has opened up for a training unit. Less field stress, more leadership. I think you've earned it." It was more than a new post. It was a validation, a new beginning, offered by the one institution that had never failed me. That night, I sat at my laptop and composed 2 emails. The first was to Gideon's lawyer, a brief formal notice that all future contact regarding his impending federal case was to be directed through Ashokal Ra. It was easy, clinical. The second was harder. It was addressed to Genevieve. I typed and deleted several versions, trying to find the right words, before realizing the fewest words were the most powerful. The final email contained only a single sentence. "All future communication regarding Ren will be handled through a court-appointed co-parenting service. Do not contact us directly." My finger hovered over the send button. This was it, the final necessary severance. This was drawing a line not in the sand, but in concrete. I clicked the button. The action was quiet, but it felt as definitive as slamming a vault door shut. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I found Alara in the living room, curled up on the couch, the glow from a street lamp casting long shadows on the floor. "Do you hate her?" I asked, the question I had been afraid to voice. Alara was quiet for a long time, staring into the darkness. "I don't know," she said finally. "Right now, I don't feel much of anything, except sad. I feel sad for her, sad for a woman who chose a picture of a family over the actual people in it." I nodded, understanding completely. I thought of the Serenity Prayer, a phrase I'd seen on countless posters and plaques over the years. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I could not change my mother. Her coldness, her obsession with image, those were her choices. The courage to change the things I can. I had done that. I had protected my sister and my niece. I had changed their world for the better. And the wisdom to know the difference. That was the final piece. The wisdom to stop fighting unwinnable wars and to start building a new peace. "We're going to be okay, Alara," I said, and for the first time, I believed it with my entire being. "We'll make our own peace." 6 months later, the world had tilted back on its axis, finding a new, quieter equilibrium. I drove down a sun-dappled street in Steilacoom, a peaceful coastal town near JBLM, the salty air of the Puget Sound drifting through my open window. Ilara and Ren had moved into a small, charming rental house with a little front yard and a view of the water. When I walked through the door, I was met not with the heavy silence of fear, but with the warm, comforting smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. The air was filled with Ren's happy laughter. She was zipping around the living room in a new, state-of-the-art electric wheelchair, her movements independent and free. Ilara was in the kitchen, a smudge of flour on her cheek, looking more radiant and at peace than I'd seen her in 20 years. She had enrolled in an online graphic design course, finally resurrecting a dream she had buried long ago. In the front yard, the first buds were appearing on the rose bushes she had planted. This was peace. Not a peace that was given, but one that had been fought for, earned, and carefully built from the ground up. My own world had found a new rhythm too. In my new role as a training commander, I spent more time mentoring young soldiers. One day, a young female specialist came to my office, her shoulders slumped, her eyes filled with a familiar mix of fear and confusion. Her family was pressuring her to send her entire paycheck home every month, leaving her with almost nothing. They were using love as a weapon, just as Genevieve had. I closed the door and sat down with her, not as her captain, but as someone who understood. "I know that feeling," I told her, my voice gentle. "That feeling that their love is conditional, that your worth is tied to what you can provide for them." I did more than just walk her through the legal steps to protect her finances and set up a separate bank account. I listened. I shared a piece of my own story. "Your value is not determined by them," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "It is determined by your actions, your integrity, and your character. You get to decide what you are worth." In helping her find her strength, I realized my own scars were no longer points of weakness. They had become a source of empathy, a bridge to connect with and help others. My pain had been repurposed into power. On a bright Sunday afternoon, during a visit to their new home, Ilara handed me a small velvet-lined box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on the soft fabric, was the Wren necklace. It had been professionally repaired and polished, the silver gleaming, the delicate bird looking whole and new again. "This belongs to you," Ilara said, her eyes shining. "It's a symbol of safety. You brought that back to us." I took the necklace out and fastened it around my neck. It felt different now. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a medal. A quiet reminder of the most important mission I had ever undertaken. Just then, Wren zoomed over in her new chair and wrapped her small arms around my legs, hugging me tightly. "I love you, Aunt Perry," she said, her voice bright and clear. Those 4 simple words, spoken with such pure, uncomplicated love, held more weight and meaning than any official commendation or promotion I had ever received. I looked from Wren's smiling face to Ilara's, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was it. This was my legacy. Driving home later that day, as the sun began to set, the majestic, snow-capped peak of Mount Rainier dominated the skyline. The setting sun painted its slopes in hues of pink and gold. The mountain stood silent, immense, and unshakable. A perfect mirror of the resilience I had finally found within myself. It had been there through the entire storm, a constant, steady presence, and now it was bathed in the light of a new day. That evening, I opened a new journal. It wasn't a case file or a logbook for work. The pages were clean, empty, and waiting. On the first page, I wrote a single, definitive entry. Flint's legacy is not silence. It is protection. It is freedom. It is love, by choice. I closed the book, the leather cover cool beneath my hand. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in my life, it was not shrouded in shadow. It was wide open, and it was filled with light. My story has found its peaceful chapter, but it taught me one profound truth. The silence is often the heaviest burden, and you don't have to carry it alone. Finding your voice is the first step toward finding your own sunrise, just as I found mine over the peak of Mount Rainier. If my journey resonated with you, and you believe in the power of a story to heal and inspire, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories of resilience waiting to be told, and by joining us, you ensure you'll be there to hear them. Thank you for listening.